Good morning, this is Dr. Joseph Parker, and this is Addiction Science Outreach. So let's talk a little bit about Matthew Perry. Let's talk about what went wrong in his life and what led to his death. Well, when we look at addiction, we look back at what was the fundamental problem that the person was trying to treat with that substance. What were they, quote, self-medicating? Now, it's dangerous to use the term self-medication because, one, alcohol is not a medication in general. It's used for a few things. And there's different forms of alcohol. Some of them you cannot take orally. But this was ethanol, all right? And it has been used as a medicine for a long time because it is psychotropic. It alters our thinking, right? So what would make someone drawn to alcohol? What would make them drawn to using too much alcohol and then perhaps draw them to ketamine, which is a totally different molecule? Well, the alcohol acts, first off, there's two systems in the brain. There's lots of systems in the brain. There are two main neurotransmitters in the brain that control activation and inhibition. So to speed the brain up, the neurotransmitter is called glutamate. To slow the brain down, the neurotransmitter is called GABA. The entire brain uses that everywhere. There's no system in the brain that does not use one of those. Or does not use both of those. And so you can speed neural processing up or slow it down by the use of either glutamate to speed things up, GABA to slow things down. Alcohol and most sedatives, even barbiturates and benzodiazepines, they bind the GABA receptor and make it work better. So the GABA receptor is on these neurons, and when it's activated, when gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, binds the receptor, opens, right, a pore in the cell and allows chloride to go through. That chloride hyperpolarizes the neuron, which means makes it less likely to fire. Once a neuron's been hyperpolarized, it quiets down, right? So if we suffer from anxiety, if we suffer from thoughts, if we have ruminating depression, where we just constantly pick ourselves apart, pick our lives apart and all that, we can't sleep, right? Alcohol helps. It slows down everything in the brain, though, so it's going to slow down the area that makes you worry the most, which mostly the amygdala that makes you feel worry, and then it generates the emotions of things you worry about. You picture it in your head, it generates an emotion attached to it, and kind of plants that emotion onto a body sensation in an area of the brain called the insula. So we feel our own pain and other people's pain in an area of the brain called the insula. So when we feel sick to our stomach because something upsets us, or we feel, our heart's breaking, that's mapped onto that area of the brain called the insula. And that's where we feel our internal state. Well, if somebody is suffering terribly and they are feeling the pain, the agony of that, it's a pain, just like anything else. It's physical. And so someone with severe anxiety might be drawn to alcohol. Strangely, people with depression are also drawn to alcohol. And the reasoning for that is that alcohol, and I had trouble understanding this at first. Why would anyone with depression want alcohol, right? Alcohol is a sedative. It's depressing. It's a depressant. Well, alcohol also inhibits the neurons that are holding back dopamine from the nucleus accumbens. So when we talk about addiction, we're talking about a reward stimulus, right? A feeling of euphoria, a reward. Usually, that's mediated by dopamine. Dopamine is transmitted from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens, and those cells then release endorphins saying, hey, you've done something good, be happy. And we get little rewards like that. If we see something attractive, we get a tiny dose to motivate us to go get that. When you breed mice to not have dopamine receptors, they just lay there. You put food in front of them, they'll eat it, otherwise they won't go hunt it out and they'll die. People are the same way. We develop a syndrome called anhedonia. Nothing makes us happy. We can't feel any pleasure. So depression is kind of like sliding down into that. And the alcohol, the inhibiting effects of alcohol, inhibit the neurons that are holding back that dopamine release. So there are neurons that are themselves inhibiting neurons. So alcohol inhibits the inhibiting neurons, thereby increasing dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, thereby acting just like any other opiate does, or just like any opiate does. Alcohol is not an opiate. The opiates mimic the endorphins. They're shaped the same. So they bind the receptors, the opiate receptors in our brain, and activate them. And fentanyl, oxycodone, hydrocodone, they activate 100%, right? They bind tightly and activate 100%. Fentanyl binds very tightly. Things like buprenorphine, they bind maybe 60%, or activate 60%. Buprenorphine binds even more strongly than fentanyl. So someone's overdosing on fentanyl and they take Narcan, it may not work that effectively because the fentanyl is binding that receptor harder. You take the Narcan, which binds tightly, but does not activate, right? So you take Narcan and the endorphin can't bind, or the opiate can't bind, oxycodone, hydrocodone, fentanyl. All these do the same thing, right? People are like, oh, I'll take this opiate, but I won't take that one because that one could get me addicted. It doesn't work that way. They all have the potential. And I've spoken to a physician who was addicted to a very mild one called propoxyphene. It used to be sold as Darvocet. So I'm saying, oh, yeah, you can get addicted to propoxyphene. Some people get addicted to tramadol. But when you say get addicted to, what is addiction? Addiction is loss of control, right? When you can no longer control your use of something, then that's the definition of addiction. Loss of control requires a certain amount of, I don't want to say a predisposition, but it can be a combination of a genetic predisposition, which about 20% of us have, according to the most recent studies, plus epigenetic influences going back as far as our grandparents. Believe it or not, if your grandparents suffered a tremendously stressful event, their DNA can be tagged with these molecules that inhibit some genes and increase the activation of others, and this can influence you, right? So it was found that if the grandparents had starved during a wartime, the children and grandchildren were more likely to suffer from obesity. So we are born with all these tags from the lived experiences of our grandparents and parents, right? Which is one of the best arguments against making sure that especially pregnant women have no stress. Make sure they have a good place to live, good food, they're secure, because the stress they feel gets imprinted onto their children, onto the DNA by epigenetics, and can make them more prone to depression, more prone to anxiety, and whatever. So Mr. Perry, despite being extremely wealthy and having reached the pinnacle of acting, he's as famous as you can get. Friends was an enormous phenomenon. He's as famous as you can get. And you've got all these things. Why are you sad, right? Well, because he's suffering from a disease, a physical illness that causes his mental state to alter. So we have these systems in our brain. We've got the dorsal attention network and the ventral attention network and the executive network and the default mode network. Let's look at two of these. The default mode network is when we're thinking internally about ourselves, right? It was discovered when people were in functional MRIs and they're sitting there doing nothing and the brain's extremely active. And the researchers were waiting to give them their task to study which area of the brain would light up. But when everybody was inactive, the same pattern of brain activity occurred. Let's talk about that for a minute. So the systems in the brain don't work in isolation. They work together. Whoever said that we don't use 90% of our brains with, not accurate. We use 100% of our brains all the time, just not always to good purpose. And could we learn 10 times more than we do, or do 10 times more? Probably. At the same time, you've got to enjoy life a little bit. So you've got these different networks. Let's look at three. Let's look at the executive network, focusing on the outside world. Right? So right now I'm walking in the park thinking about talking to you. But if I see a truck drive up with three guys with rifles, I might be like, yeah, You better pay attention to that. I'm concentrating on the outside world. That is your executive network. You're thinking about making decisions. Should I stay on this path or go somewhere else? And all that. If I were not talking to you and I was just listening to maybe nice music, which I really don't do, I mainly listen to news, probably not good for me. But if I was just ruminating on my life and my life choices and where my life is right now, and am I where I wanted to be at this point in my life, and gosh, thinking about that, that would be the default mode network. And that is introspection, right? And they call it the introspective network. The extrospective network is the one where you're looking outward. Introspective, you're looking in. When you get stuck in the introspective network and you keep ruminating and agonizing over past decisions, past choices, things that didn't go right, usually it's relationships, right? Because no matter how rich you are, no matter how famous you are, you want people to love you. And there are people that you love. And those two don't always work out together, right? Sometimes you love people who don't really love you or just are not capable of giving you what you need. Good morning. And other people, other times, you love someone and they're just, you don't do it for them or for whatever reason. So that's usually a big part of, we'll say, a source of unhappiness, but realistically, there are people that are happy no matter what. There are people that are sad no matter what. This is not a choice they make. This has to do with their genetics, their epigenetics, their environmental influences, their natural set points multiplied by whatever they've experienced. So when, let's say you've got a man who has experienced abandonment issues, right? Bill Clinton, dad's not around, dad was an alcoholic, dad had a car wreck, and mom's a nurse, she's never at home. He's got stepdads, maybe they're nice, maybe they're not. He may have some abandonment issues. So he may crave attachment and love and become addicted to love, right? Addicted to that feeling of euphoria you get when someone shows you attention. So that when a young woman shows him attention in the Oval Office, knowing that his political enemies are hoping he'll do something stupid, he cannot stop himself from doing something totally stupid. Mr. Matthew Perry, despite all of his money and everything, suffered from something that caused him to ruminate and think about his life and be unhappy. And he was depressed. This underlying problem is the key to his addiction to substances, whether it's opioids, alcohol, nicotine, anything like that, right? And sometimes people heal themselves with exercise, and sometimes the exercise becomes almost an addiction in itself, right? So a good walk every morning is very, very good for you, and the best time slowing or aging slowing thing we've got right now until they get interleukin-11 antibodies rolling. But for right now, the best we've got, just regular aerobic exercise. Now, resistance training makes you look better, feel better, and it's healthy for you in its own way. Maintains your muscle mass and bone mass. But it's different. So people can get addicted, kind of. Now, addiction requires a complete loss of control. You know you shouldn't do it, right? For yourself, for your own reasons, not somebody else's. You don't want to do it. You truly don't, but you can't stop yourself. So Matthew Perry appeared to be deeply into that type of addiction. Now, so why was he using ketamine? And is ketamine this terribly addictive substance? No, it's not. It's not. Can it be habit forming? Anything that makes you feel better can be habit forming, just like the exercise can be. He could have just as likely become addicted to exercise, we'll say. And I've seen people start to look like concentration camp survivors because they won't quit cycling and running and getting that endorphin rush that occurs after exercise, that's released in our brain after exercise. So for him, he started trying ketamine. Now, why ketamine? Ketamine is not an opiate. Not an opiate. It's an anesthetic. If you take a big dose of it, it'll make you unconscious, which was really nice to have when you needed a surgery, right? They used to do eye surgery. They used to remove cataracts on people with no anesthetic. Nothing to numb the eye. I don't know how they did it, right? Well, I do. They had 5 or 6 strong guys hold you down, and the eye doctor took a very sharp knife and held your eyeball still with his fingers and did the cataract surgery. That's horrendously terrifying to think about. And you can die. You can die from the pain. You can die from stress. Any idiot that said, pain doesn't kill anyone is false. Okay, every Civil War doctor knew that pain could kill you very quickly. If they had to take a leg off, they had a certain amount of time to do it, they knew you died. And people, we know beyond any doubt, the scientific data is clear. Severe, untreated chronic pain causes early death. The stress of it predisposes you to age faster, your arteries age faster, you get blocked, you'd have a heart attack or stroke. Well, severe depression is a type of suffering, type of pain, a type of agony. And he was suffering and he was trying to get treated for that. Now, what works good as an antidepressant? Lots of times they talk about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Well, they take 6 to 8 weeks to start working in most people, and they can predispose you to, in some cases, suicidal thoughts. Now, teenagers act on these a lot more than adults, so the warning's bigger in teenagers because every warning's bigger in teenagers, right? They have less impulse control. So if an older person gets the impulse to kill themselves, they might say, I'll wait till tomorrow, right? If a young person gets the impulse to take themselves out of the equation, they might act on it because their frontal lobe's not fully myelated and they can't control their impulses as well. So those are things that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at somebody who's making bad life choices. One, what are they suffering from? What are they trying to avoid? Very rarely does someone get into serious trouble with chemicals and substance abuse and all this because they just wanted to feel good. Now, people will say, well, he wanted to escape the world. What was he trying to escape? Why would he want to escape the world? The man was a multimillionaire. He could go anywhere. He could do anything, we think. But actually, can't. He can't go anywhere without being recognized. He can't start dating anyone without thinking, well, I am a multimillionaire, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, and that means every time somebody's nice to me, are they being nice to me? Are they being nice to the money and security I can give them? So that's something that people think about, wealthy people, famous people think about. And sometimes they say, I wish I could just go into a bar and no one, recognize me. The opposite of Cheers. You want to go to a place where nobody knows your name. For him, that was not possible. Sometimes they grow beards. You see actors growing these big beards. You're saying, why in the world? That doesn't look good. Of course, it does not. Or as good as you might think it would if he were shaved. But they do that so they won't be recognized. Women quite often wear the big sunglasses and the hats and the scarves, and they do things also. Now, they probably loved COVID because you could be walking right next to any famous actor, right? You're in the park with Brad Pitt, you don't know. Guy's wearing a mask, right? Now, if you wear a mask, they wonder why. So they have no anonymity. They have trust issues. And he's already suffering from some mental issue. He's got depression. He's got all these things going on. Ketamine reverses depression almost immediately. The effects are within half an hour to an hour, and they can last weeks to months, right? It's a very strong antidepressant. And it is approved for that purpose. So esketamine, so molecules always come in two shapes, right? A left-handed and a right-handed molecule is created in most chemical reactions. These are called enantiomers. There's a left one called sinister, or S, and a right-handed one called dexter. Sinister is also levo. So levoamphetamine is left-handed amphetamine. Dextroamphetamine is right-handed amphetamine. Well, in this case, S, or sinister ketamine, which is the left-handed molecule, is approved for as esketamine, right? Esketamine, very cute, for the treatment of addiction, and they use a lot in the VA. It's a nasal spray. It's no different than taking the ketamine by shot in the arm. It's very cheap to take by a shot in the arm or intravenously, right? So you need a nurse or a doctor to help you do that, and unless you're used to intravenous injections, which is another discussion. So what happened to Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry liked the relief of depression he got from treatment with ketamine. Now, what do human beings do when they like something? We do it too much. That's just our nature, right? And that's why doctors are not allowed to prescribe or treat themselves or their immediate family. Because if my child's suffering, I might be prone to giving too much. Because I can't personally stand the suffering of my child, because that's my kid, right? Well, another doctor can come along and he can say, suffering, terrible, I feel your pain. No, you can't have more because I don't think it's good for you. I'm afraid you'll stop breathing. So doctors are not allowed to treat themselves. Patients should not be allowed to treat themselves. I don't care how wealthy they are. I don't care how much you want to influence them. So Matthew Perry was going to a ketamine clinic and getting regular infusion. And the DEA is like, oh, he developed addiction there. And then, no. The addiction, the problems that led to that was there all along. All it did was give him some relief, right? But it wasn't fast enough. It wasn't strong enough. We want more. That's just human nature. Now, when he went to these other doctors and said, or to his assistant said, if that occurred, allegedly, all that legal stuff, if he goes somewhere and says, I want more, someone has to tell him, hey, you use enough of that stuff and it will knock you out. It is an anesthetic at high doses. Now, the dose that they use in the nasal spray, very low dose. It goes going straight to the noggin, right? The olfactory nerve is the only thing that goes straight to the brain. So you can spray something in the nose straight to the brain. That's why they put Narcan in the nose. But if you're going to take it in the oral form, there is a ketamine powder in capsules. That's usually for chronic pain treatment because it turns down the volume on chronic nerve pain and also it increases neuroplasticity. And it could be a big part of its antidepressant effects because it immediately increases the little spiny protrusions on the dendrites so that your brain can make new connections, and it breaks you out of an old habit, an old cycle, an old pattern of neural activity. So there he is ruminating and thinking. He takes his ketamine. All of a sudden things are bright. He's thinking of new thoughts. He's making new connections, right? Neurogenesis is sped up a little bit in the hippocampus, so you're making some new brain cells. They're wiring themselves in. But for him, his depression is profound enough that he appears to rapidly slip back into it. So ketamine clinic's like, hey, this is all we can do for you. So he goes to his assistant and he wants more ketamine. Supposedly, the assistant went to the ketamine queen, and this is sometimes called a runner. So there are a few doctors out there willing to sell medications. Now, right now, they've rolled up about 3,000 doctors. And I've looked at these cases. I've looked at hundreds of these cases and said, why did this doctor get prosecuted? Right? And 80% of the time, I can find no good reason. The DEA just did not like who they were treating, or said that they were treating, quote, too much, right? So you're a pain clinic, you're treating too much pain. Or you've got a pain management operation, your primary care clinic, you're treating too much pain. Well, were patients coming to that doctor in pain? Cancer and other serious medical problems that nobody could alleviate? If the doctor believed the patient had pain, that is not criminal. If you have to lie to a doctor to get them to prescribe something, you are the criminal, including the DEA agent that does that, or the compromised patient that comes in and lies about their pain to get a prescription so they can show up in court and say, I didn't really need it and the doctor should have known that. You're a criminal. The doctor might be naive, right? Doesn't make him criminal. In the case of Matthew Perry, the government alleges that ketamine, which is cheap, been around a long time, the injectable vials were $12 each, right? And these doctors sold the vials directly to the assistant or through the ketamine queen for $2,000 each. Now, you could say, isn't this legitimate? Don't people take shots at home like insulin? Sure. People take shots at home like insulin. Can insulin kill you? Absolutely. You take a too high of a dose of insulin and you pass out, you'll drown in your hot tub just as effectively as if you took ketamine or any other anesthetic. The problem is, people don't enjoy taking insulin, right? It does not release endorphins. It is not reinforcing. It does not immediately relieve their depression. And so people aren't prone to taking more of it than they need. Matter of fact, they're very careful to try to not take more of it than they need, because if they know, you've seen in the media where somebody was murdered with insulin or whatever. People know you take too much insulin, you're going to die. Plus, they know what happens when your blood sugar gets too low in your cells and you're staggering around acting like you're drunk, and then sometimes the police pull you over and beat you to death because you're not complying. And problem is you act just like you're drunk when you're hypoglycemic and all that. So take too much, get hypoglycemia, all this stuff. So insulin can be taken at home. Why can't ketamine be taken at home? Can be. Can be. So these doctors could have told a nurse, so maybe 1 to 1.5 milligrams per kilogram in a shot in the arm. You can do that in your clinic. You can do that at home or whatever. For the capsules that you can take, the powder, it's usually 25 to 50 milligrams 2 to 3 times a day, starting with 1 at bedtime and then advancing to 2 a day and then 3 a day. Try to help someone rewire, get out of their depression. And those are not big doses. A man my size, and I don't want to pan down and show you how big I really am. But anyway, 100 kilograms, 220 pounds on a good day. 1 to 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, 100 kilograms. So 100 to 150 milligrams would be a reasonable dose to treat my depression with a shot in the arm. If I'm going to use the cheap medicine, right? Because, you know, the DEA will say, well, only esketamine is approved for the treatment of depression and pain. And so depression really, multi-medication resistant depression and depression with suicidal ideation. Those are the 2 indications. They're saying that's the only one approved. What does that mean? That means nothing. That means nothing. That means that they're quoting the pharmaceutical company line. Pay a whole bunch, pay thousands of dollars for this liquid in the nose because we separated out the left-handed from the right-handed molecules and we were able to patent that, right? So the shot in the arm, the infusion with the racemic mixture, powdered pills, perfectly fine. Perfectly legitimate, perfectly good medicine at the right dose. The wrong dose of anything will kill you. If you look behind me right now, see that water there? About 600 people every year die from drinking too much of it. It's called polydipsia. They drink too much water, they get hyponatremic, they have seizures, and they die. Poisoned by the water. No. You can kill yourself with anything, right? Too much oxygen made babies go blind. And would kill you. If you went back to dinosaur days where the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere was about 40%, twice what it is now, you'd die. You'd die pretty rapid. So even a nourishing element like oxygen will kill you in too high of a dose. So, is ketamine a dangerous drug? Not really. It's very hard to overdose on ketamine itself. Usually when someone has a problem with ketamine, it's just found in their system. Something else had its effect. And there was an amplification, right? This is called polypharmacy or synergy. There are chemicals that work together well and potentiate each other. Sometimes you'll see doctors using maybe a low-dose benzodiazepine with a low-dose opiate. That's because the two work in different ways. Side effects come with the dose, whereas the synergistic effect can mean you can use a lower amount of both of those and have a much more beneficial effect. This is another thing the authorities don't understand. Using prescribing dangerous medications and dangerous combinations. Well, that's what every doctor does. It's what doctors are supposed to do. Safe medications and safe combinations are over the counter, and they still kill people. Aspirin's over the counter? Probably wouldn't be if we were approving it now, because it can drop you dead in a heartbeat. Tylenol causes half of all the liver failure in the world. Everything can kill you in the wrong dose, just about. So he's taking his ketamine, and he wants more. And he goes to the assistant, whoever he went through, and the ketamine queen perhaps went through her, and he got more ketamine. And then they let him take it home. They sold him a whole bunch. Now, what is the difference between a drug dealer and a doctor treating pain? Now, this gets dicey, right? We have capitalized medicine in the United States of America. We do not have socialized medicine. Doctors don't get paid just for being doctors. And everybody doesn't have insurance, and insurance won't pay for everything. And insurance in this country is a scam. Used to, the insurance companies had to spend at least 80% of what they took in on the patient, right? They got rid of those limitations in like the 70s or 80s. And that's when companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield, which were 2 separate companies and then joined, that's when they went from being non-profit entities, which is how they started, to being for-profit, because they're like, okay, every cancer patient whose treatment we deny, we make hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, because it's expensive treating somebody with cancer. So what did they start doing? Just don't treat somebody with cancer, right? Take their money, but then when they get sick, say, no, you had a UTI back in college, you didn't tell us about, you withheld important medical information because that could have been related to your cancer. So we say, no, you sue, right? Or you appeal, and then you go through this, well, now you're dead, right? The cancer's already killed you. So that was their model for a long time. Affordable Care Act came along and said, you can't do that anymore. That's great. Or it would be great, except that With the Affordable Care Act was also a rule that these insurance companies will join with the FBI and they will root out fraud, waste, and abuse. Except these giant companies got to decide what's fraud, waste, and abuse. And the DEA got to decide what's a good doctor. And they didn't ask the medical organizations, the American Medical Association, which I have, a big problem with them not standing up for doctors during all this. And things went terribly bad. So now we have health insurance companies attacking independent doctors to try to shut them down. So anytime something like this happens, you're going to hear calls in the media to stop these ketamine clinics. It wasn't the ketamine clinic that killed Matthew Perry. Okay? And some would argue Matthew Perry killed Matthew Perry because he made this decision, but he was in a vulnerable time. He had entrusted his health to physicians who sold the medications out the back door. And that's where you go from being a doctor to being a drug dealer. Okay? Sold it out the back door. Didn't treat with a whole bunch because you thought that was best. Didn't, charge everybody the same amount for the complexity of their medical problems, and charge them for your time, which is what a doctor's paying, charging for his time or her time. You sell the medications out the back door. So that's what they did. They bought ketamine for $12, allegedly, for $12 a vial, and sold it for $2,000 a vial. Immediately that raises some red flags, but pharmaceutical industry does that all the time. The big companies do that all the time. They buy a cancer medicine for $40. They sell it for $4,000 because they know you'll die without it. So you either cough up the cash or die. Well, they can do that because they're a giant big company, and they do it openly. These guys are texting back and forth. Let's not call it ketamine. Let's call it Dr. Pepper, right? Allegedly. And the ketamine got from that doctor's office, where he could inject it reasonably under medical supervision, to the patient, Matthew Perry, without going through proper channel. No nurse or other medical authority, good morning, there to make sure that he was safe. And because of that, he died. Just like Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson had his own doctor at home, right? Well, the doctor stepped out to do something. He didn't have anyone there to back him up. Didn't have a nurse there. Why not? Michael Jackson couldn't afford a nurse? No. Most likely. He couldn't find a qualified nurse who was willing to do that, who was willing to say, hey, the guy can't sleep and you're going to propofol him at home? What if something goes wrong? Do we have the equipment here? Do we have a crash cart? Do we have a crash team? What if his heart stops? Do you have the equipment here to deal with that? No? Okay, well, I'm not risking my license, right? So the doctor's there doing it himself because he has fallen victim to the star power, right? Can't say no to the star. You have to say no to the star. Stars have the same influence on us probably as immediate family members, sometimes more, right? So maybe you've got a cranky cousin you don't like very well. If he asks you for something, you say nope, because you're a close family member. But if a big star asks you for something, God, you don't want to disappoint them. So you're prone to giving them what they want. But these guys are a little more mercenary than that, because it's not like they were just starstruck, right? Because allegedly, the text messages say, how much can we soak this loser for, whatever they said. That's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible attitude to have. Doctors work long and hard for their degrees, and they try very hard to make sure that they can take care of their families, and they want to live a good life. Everybody does, right? But if money was all we were interested in, we would go into business. We would be a pharmaceutical executive like Shkreli, or be the CEO of Boeing, right? Two Boeing planes go down, kill about 300 people because of engineering mistakes that the Boeing chain of command was supposed to make sure it didn't happen. And what happened to the CEO? $32 million paycheck that year. $32 million. With a $2.3 million bonus. What was the bonus for? Who the heck knows? Probably stock. Stock goes up, stock buybacks, who knows? But no doctor is out there making that much. Now, there are entrepreneurial doctors. They own multiple clinics, and the government targets them because any independent physician is a threat to these giant healthcare industry monopolies, right? Because if you have somewhere you can go and you don't have to buy their insurance, then they don't have you locked in. So that's why you'll see the DEA and saying, well, And the doctor didn't take insurance and charged cash. Therefore, what did he charge cash? Greenbacks? Or did he or she take credit cards and debit cards? One cannot be traced easily, greenback. The other one can be traced and is basically a completely trackable exchange. So there's a big difference of whether the doctor says, pay me in cash, greenback, I don't want a credit card, don't want a debit card, or we don't accept insurance so that we can charge you less, right? So we don't have all that infrastructure for billing, for coding and billing and collections and dealing with the insurance companies. We cut all that out. We charge you maybe $125 a visit. There are a lot of doctors that started doing that. They started saying, look, a visit's $75. And the patient would say, what? You'll see a patient for $75? Yeah, if I don't have to pay all these people to build an insurance company to get 30% of what I bill. See, I bill. So when I work for a big company, we bill $220 so we can collect 70, say, right? And then divide that among the other staff. Well, charge you, 75, 50. And for a basic, simple little visit, a little urgent care thing, maybe you got a bad sinus infection, whatever. And you don't have all that infrastructure. You don't have to do all that. So this was a threat to the insurance companies. So they called in their buddies, right? They're working on the same task force, the FBI, DEA, OIG task force to make sure there's no fraud, waste, and abuse. And they said, you know who's a bad doctor? Independent doctors. Doctors who don't take insurance. If they don't take our insurance, are bad doctors. So very quickly, these doctors are being targeted using this criteria. So if you accept regular payments or cash payments and don't insist that people have insurance, they will target you. So you're going to see these ketamine clinics getting targeted, shut down. You're going to see new companies pop up to treat ADHD that focus on that and get good at it. You're going to see them shut down. Not because they're necessarily criminal. Because what they do is they grab everything, they grab all the patients, they scan all the patients for someone who has criminal charges hanging over their head to say, can you say what we need you to say? Because if you can, we can get your charges lowered or dropped. If you can't, we can't help you. You're looking at 20 years. Well, magically, they suddenly recall the doctor forgot to do vital signs, said he didn't care about me, said he hoped I got addicted and died. You know what I mean. So what these witnesses say under coercion or when they're being threatened, that's very different than what they say when they're not being coerced or threatened, right? Now, in the case of Matthew Perry, a lot of people already pled guilty. That does not mean they are actually guilty. Lots of people plead guilty because they are too afraid to try to take it to court against the government that has unlimited access to taxpayer money. They can spend $1 million making you look guilty. Not because you are guilty, because they make you look that way. So unless you have those resources, which Alec Baldwin did, right? And that's where law enforcement gets in trouble. Do you think the prosecutor in Alec Baldwin's case had never, ever hidden evidence and chose to do it for the first time with an extremely famous person with millions of dollars for an offense and great investigators out there poring over everything to keep that man out of jail? No, I don't think so. I think that was standard operating procedure, and they did it all the time. And they did it reflexively in the Alec Baldwin case, and his investigators were sharp enough to catch him, and that's where investigation comes in. If your lawyer does not do an independent investigation, you're dead. Okay, you're dead. If they trust what the government says, you're dead. In the Matthew Perry case, and quite often, sometimes, the government gets it right. They're exactly right, right? And now, would they have done this for anybody but Matthew Perry? Probably not. Will this benefit everybody? Maybe. Depends on what comes from it. If nobody can get ketamine treatment, it doesn't benefit anybody. But it's already illegal for doctors to sell prescriptions, right? 1970, the Controlled Substances Act gets passed, and it says you must be registered to dispense or prescribe controlled medications. Okay, so that goes into effect. Well, does that apply to doctors or not? Well, they didn't know until 1974. In 1974, a doctor named Moore was selling methadone by the milligram. And the DEA said, we want to prosecute this guy. We're going to go ahead and prosecute this guy. And the Supreme Court looked at it and said, yeah, he's selling pills by the milligram. He's selling the pills instead of selling his time, his medical services. He's a drug dealer. No different than a street drug dealer. The DEA said, yay, now we can control the practice of medicine. Now we can target any doctor we want to and say they're no different than a drug dealer because they get paid and they prescribe a controlled medication if we don't like who they're treating. So mission creep came in. So very few doctors are willing to sell pills. Right? Why would you go to school for all the time? Most doctors become doctors because they love people and want to help people, and they value themselves according to how much benefit they bring to society. Others aren't like that. A few doctors are psychopathic. Right? 1% of the population is psychopathic, but it's higher in surgeons. Don't want to pick on surgeons. It's higher in surgeons. Because you get a trauma surgeon, right? You roll in all busted up, and maybe you're a young person, attractive person, you got bones sticking out, and the doctor looks at you and says, I can fix that. Right? You don't want a doctor that starts bawling, says, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I can't believe this happened to you. You don't want that, right? So psychopathy is a normal variant of human behavior, about 1% of the population. That's about, we have 300 million people in the United States. So about 3 million psychopaths. They're usually wonderful people. They do a good job. They are attorneys, doctors, judges, soldiers. Soldiers, man, you in battle, afraid of nothing. Now, will he leave you there if he sees that you're shot and probably aren't going to survive? Yes. They'll just, yep, he's probably going to die. I'm heading this way. They won't go back and get blown up to save you. But if saving you is convenient, they'll have no fear, right? They can't have fear, usually. They cannot feel the emotions. Nothing gets mapped onto their insula. Some doctors are like that. And when Matthew Perry comes to them and says, I'm in pain or whatever, they say, this is an opportunity. He's a rich guy. I can charge him a bunch, right? 22 vials of ketamine for $50,000 when they cost $12 each. So, 22 should have been, what, 100, 150, 180 bucks, somewhere around there, 160. That's not reasonable, right? That's not making a profit. Now, I always tell doctors, if you are talking about a medicine, don't prescribe it. If you're prescribing it, don't talk about it. Don't get paid to talk about it. If you have an in-house pharmacy, don't have anything controlled, because it's just too easy for someone to say that you prescribe it to make more money, just like your in-house tests. I don't believe doctors should make profits off the tests they run, because if you order a lot of tests, they will say that you're doing it just to make money. And if you don't order a lot of tests, then you didn't need an in-house lab in the first place, and it's an expense that you don't need. So with these doctors, it really looks like, if the text messages are accurate, if the government's not lying to us, which they often do, that these doctors were much more mercenary. And one of them immediately pled guilty, right? And while I said that a guilty plea is not evidence of true guilt, right? You have to look at what the doctor said, right? And the details he gives. But they have the text messages, so, everybody's worried, oh, they're giving us a COVID shot because it's going to track us. No, this little device I'm talking into right now, it's a tracker. So everybody with one of these is tracking, and everybody text messages, and that's very strange. Back when people had to make phone calls were not recorded and not routinely recorded, but now they text, and they text things like this. And it's just human nature. And now that they can grab all that, one, they know exactly where you were when. Two, they know what you're saying. So, and they can twist anything so that you can say something innocuous and they can twist it. That's why the attorneys say don't talk to law enforcement, right? But if law enforcement comes and they grab all your stuff and you have stuff on it that clearly shows criminal intent, where it shows, I know this is criminal and I'm going to do it anyway. That is what the Supreme Court said in the case of Ruan, Dr. Shiulu Ruan, where they said, you can't just throw a doctor in prison because of the way he prescribed or she prescribed, or because of the way they practiced medicine, or for any reason other than that they had true criminal intent. They knew what they were doing was wrong and did it anyway. Now, the DEA is getting around this by paying medical experts to come into court and say that whatever that doctor did that they've targeted was wrong. Whether it was objectively wrong, textbook doesn't get to come into court. The jury knows nothing. The judge knows nothing about medicine. So there you are, facing a jury and a judge who know nothing about medicine. And you've got the government spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to pay people with credentials to say that what you did was wrong. So expect that to happen in the Matthew Perry case for this doctor who's going to take it to trial. There are going to be experts up there, and they will convince you. Even medical professionals listening to them will be convinced, though, that, wow, that ketamine is the devil. And then the defense expert will get up there, and he will convince you ketamine's just the most wonderful thing. The answer is almost always in the middle. But what this boils down to is not, did Matthew Perry become addicted to ketamine? Not really. Not really. He was already addicted before he started ketamine. Ketamine helped relieve some of his suffering. Was he addicted to not wanting to suffer? We're all addicted to not wanting to suffer, right? If I set your leg on fire and you beg for medicine, oh, drug-seeking behavior. No, it's treatment-seeking behavior. It's relief-seeking behavior. The doctors had no compassion for him. Must a doctor have compassion for you? No. No, as long as they make the right decision. Even if they're one of those, 1 in 100 that have psychopathy, and they can't have empathy for it if they make the right decision. But in this case, the doctors were allowing someone to use at home a medication that, if you take too much, will make you pass out. And a medication that someone is prone to want to overuse because it makes them feel good or makes them feel better, makes them suffer less. Those are things that you have to weigh. Now, there's a risk and benefit analysis, right? And they probably could have given him a powdered pill, whatever, and a low dose, and you can't take that many pills unless you're trying to kill yourself. But when it comes to injections, it's very easy to kill yourself with injections because they go straight in. They hit hard and fast. They can, the ketamine didn't suppress his respirations. I read the coroner's report. They're not saying he died, he overdosed on ketamine. No, he did not. He went into a hot tub with ketamine and buprenorphine, which is a 60% opiate agonist, right? Cranking those receptors up 60%. And it's to help treat addiction, but it is itself an opiate. Don't fool yourself. It's not the most wonderful medication ever made. It's not a terrible drug. It's just a medication, right? Tramadol's almost the same, except it also bumps up serotonin. Ketamine has other effects also in NMDA receptors, some serotonin neurogenesis and all this stuff. But in the end, ketamine does not cause a surge of dopamine release. Ketamine is not addictive in the traditional sense because it is the dopamine surge that causes addiction. But people are prone to take too much of it because it makes them feel better, and that looks like that's what Matthew Perry did, and he passed out. He passed out while in water, right? Now, this also comes down to patient responsibility. Now, did the doctor do bad things? Of course. You're selling pills by the milligram, by the vial. That is one of the things the Supreme Court said makes you a drug dealer. The text messages, if they're true, tend to show that they had criminal knowledge and chose to take those actions anyway, so that can be construed as criminal intent, though that can be twisted. We'll see what comes out in court. But the Supreme Court has said, if a doctor knows that what they're doing is wrong, they do it anyway, that's criminal. It looks like this is more than just malpractice, right? So malpractice, the doctor just doesn't know. He says, I thought it was okay to do this, and I guess it's not, right? And, that's dicey too. All these doctors using ivermectin during the pandemic, were they heroes or monsters? Who knows? The evidence is still out now. The evidence was enough to convince the CDC that this shouldn't be used, and they said don't. The AMA said don't. All these organizations came out and said don't. But a prison doctor in the state of Arkansas gave inmates, unknown to them, ivermectin. And the inmates sued. Some of them got sick. Ivermectin's a deworming agent. It can make people sick. Does it affect the immune system and help with COVID? Who knows? The studies seem to indicate it does not, right? But for every study, there's an equal and opposite study, and so you really have to dig into things. Medicine is extremely complicated. That's another thing the DEA doesn't understand. Medicine's complicated. It's not simple as they make it to be. So, ketamine's a reasonable medication, should have been okay to use. They sold it by the bottle, which seems to indicate that they were acting in a criminal manner. It's an argument in favor of that stance. And then some of the text messages seems to imply criminal intent. It definitely was not a safe or smart thing to do. And then Mr. Perry, if you are a patient, especially if you're a big star, understand that people are willing to do what's not in your best interest because they are starstruck, enamored of your status and money, right? Rush Limbaugh is getting like 30 oxycodone pills a day. He's a victim. give that man the Medal of Freedom, right? Some poor, destitute woman on the street using heroin, she's a criminal. Lock her the blank up. So you get these disparities of treatment depending on who you are. And usually that works in the person's favor. But in Mr. Perry's case, it did not. Because they were willing to do what was not in his best interest for multiple reasons. So, Mr. Perry's gone, and people will pay. There will probably be a huge backlash against ketamine clinics, and then people who need treatment can't get it because one doctor did not say no to one patient when the patient could not say no to himself. This has been Addiction Science Outreach. I'm Dr. Parker. You have a great day.